Just to piggyback Coach on a couple things. First of all, Coach Kelly was incredible in terms of his willingness to get out this year. He was out a lot during the season watching guys play. I think the kind of sped up time period here made it important that he get out, and then, you know, Coach's willingness to be out those first 3 weeks of contact were incredibly important as we were trying to close guys up for this date. Coach Kelly was tremendous. We do have to acknowledge the work of our staff. Our guys were grinding hard out there on the road. A lot of planes, a lot of time away. We gotta, if I could say thank you to their families. Clark Lee has a newborn child at home, and Clark was one of the guys that on Friday nights of home games was out seeing players. That's hard. So our wives, you know, the children, we went from the Stanford game to essentially being away for 3 weeks, coming home for a day and a half to do a bowl practice and an official visit, and then you're right back out on the road. So a special thank you to the families. And from our perspective, the recruiting staff and all the staff on campus that helped us out, we appreciate them a great deal. If I could just add a thought or two here, I would say let's be very careful about who we're anointing the next stars. I mean, that puts pressure on 17, 18-year-old kids. That's not fair. Who's going to start as a freshman? I mean, it's hard to start a John Carroll as a freshman. That's Harvard of East Cleveland, for those of you who don't know where John Carroll is. That's a lot of pressure to put on a kid. You know, time will tell. These things will sort themselves out. Obviously, we feel good that these young men can come in and compete and play at a high level, but sometimes it takes time, and we need to allow for that learning curve and that process before we start anointing guys the saviors. And what often happens, it's a result of what rivals or 24/7, the star system, and why isn't this guy playing sooner? Look at all the offers he had. Well, often one doesn't have anything to do with the other. And I think about, in my first experience here, Kyle McCarthy, who that was the 25th guy in the class, and we beat Navy and Youngstown State to get him. And at the end of Kyle's time here, he's a captain, a starter, and a very decorated player. So, you know, I know it's that time of year. Hope springs eternal on signing day. We just signed 20 All-Americans, but I think we need to, you know, give it a chance to let this thing sort itself out. So with that, I'll take any questions that I can help with from the recruiting office perspective. So.
Brian, I don't know if you were listening to all of Coach Kelly's talk, but I'll ask you some similar questions. And you've been a head coach. Can you imagine playing a game this week tied in with the signing date?
You know, and in the world that I was in, if you had a great year, you were playing December 19th or something to that effect. It would be difficult. It was difficult just trying to manage making sure that our coordinators were back here on practice days, to guys doing home visits and going back to a hotel and watching LSU film on their laptops, trying to develop scouting reports. It's difficult. I was thinking about this morning. What's life like if you were at Akron and you played in Florida last night and you're trying to sign today? I think it is a little different between the Power 5 and the Group of 5. I think the early signing date, I don't see a lot of Group of 5 teams, you know, adding more than half their class. I think what this signing date does is, for the smaller programs, it's really going to clear up their boards. I mean, that was always our big fear at Nevada, was that you had a guy committed forever, you invested a year, and with a week to go, Oregon State came in and said, come play in the Pac-12. And that was a fear of ours. But it's like Coach said, it's got pluses and minuses for both sides, but it would be difficult to imagine, how do you manage this? How do you get into homes and show young men that they're important and at the same time serve your team the way that you need to going into a bowl game. It's uncharted territory for everybody. And the one thing that's worth mentioning that nobody's talked about is that this was the first year with the December 20th signing date, but we did not have the spring and summer visits that are going to be allowed next year, where a young man can take an official visit in spring and summer of his junior year. So this really was a condensed calendar without the ability to get people on your campus officially sooner. That's important to a school like ours. There are 12 states represented in this signing class thus far. There's 28, I believe, represented on our team. We're not a school that 80% of our class can drive here for an unofficial visit. So the sped up timing of the early signing date combined with not being able to bring young men here officially in the spring and summer made it a little bit difficult and a little bit unique.
Kind of in accordance with that, Coach said the early signing date has put the commitment back into commitment. Do you think in general that this plays to Notre Dame's strengths?
I think so. I think if a young man wants Notre Dame and identifies and it fits on both ends, taking the 7 to 8 extra weeks that people have to come in and essentially try and confuse an 18-year-old, I think that's good for schools like ours. It puts the onus on the young man in terms of academics. We're not a place that can sign a guy and not have a test score. All right, so there are places in the country where guys are waiting on their first SAT to come back, and they can deal with that. Ours is not a place that can do that. So I think it speeds up everything just a little bit. Whether or not that's good or bad, I'm not there yet. It's also new that we're going to have to sit back in a year or two and take a step back because, frankly, we're not even sure how many guys are still going to be out there. I mean, we still have work to do. Coach was very clear about that. And we have some guys that we know are going to be out there. But what's the board? I mean, you're really going to reset your board with, all right, who's still out there? You know, and so that's a little bit unique this time around. So
I won't ask you who you think is going to start from this class,
I mean, that's crazy.
I will ask you the same question I did Coach Kelly. And who do you think some of the more underrated players are in this class?
I am a big Jameer Smith fan, and I'm not sure that he got the type of recognition that he deserved. He's a big physical back, 5'10 and a half, 5'11", nearly 200 pounds as a high school senior, north and south runner, exceptional student, terrific kid. When you asked the question originally, I thought about Tariq Bracy. He's in Northern California, Metro Oakland, which is not necessarily a recruiting destination for the people that are going to go into California. When you look at what he's done on both sides of the ball, he's a pretty unique player. I think Mabry and Dirksen, just in terms of their length and their size, these are going to be really big men that can move their feet. I know we often on the offensive line, you know, boy, he weighs 270 right now. Is he going to get big enough? We have a great strength staff. You can make them big. The world is filled with big guys, big and can move their feet and bend and athleticism. You recruit that and hand him over to Coach Bayless and his staff and let nature take its course. I think those guys are exciting. The one guy that nobody's mentioned yet that I love is Paul Moala. First of all, to keep a local guy here, how special is that we can find a player that ultimately we believe we can compete for a national championship with, that fits the academic profile and comes from 10 miles away. Whenever you can do that, it's great for your program. And he's a wonderful kid with a great family. And not a lot of Polynesian young men of Polynesian descent rolling around South Bend. It's such a unique story. It's really cool. He's a terrific kid. And, you know, that Irish invasion, those summer camps, some of that is recruiting. Some of that is hey, you want a chance? Come in and show us what you got. And that was the kid in this class that came in and took advantage of a camp date and crushed it and walked out, and everybody's like, not only can he do it, but he's our type of kid. So,
thanks, Brian.
Brian T. Wright, how much did it help having Mike Elston still on staff as the previous recruiting coordinator with you taking over ahead of the season? Oh,
it was great. I mean, there are some challenges that are unique to Notre Dame, just like there are challenges that are unique to any job. And having Mike as a guy that I could go back to and, okay, when this presented itself, how would we handle it? How did you handle it? That was a good resource. So that was valuable. And Mike was terrific. He was excited about his new role as the assistant head coach, and I was excited to be able to help our program, I thought, in terms of having the experience of looking at the big picture, the scholarship model. Dave Poloquin and I worked side by each in terms of trying to make sure that we're addressing needs, that the model, it's never going to be perfect, but you got to have a starting point here, that how you want your roster set up. We worked hard with the two new coordinators because obviously the models change depending on what you run offensively and defensively. So it's a collective, and that, thank you. That leads the opportunity for me to just mention the days of, hey, this coach recruited this guy and this coach signed 7 players, so he's the rock star. Those days are over in college football. When you look at the collective effort of area coach, position coach, recruiting, or excuse me, coordinator on that side of the ball, the head coach. Often a young man will come on campus and just connect with somebody for any given reason. There are guys that we signed in this class that could have had anywhere from 4 to 6 coaches intimately involved in that process. So the days of, hey, this one guy's a rock star recruiter, I don't think those days exist anymore in college football. It really is a collective. And I speak to that as somebody that, frankly, I'm an area recruiter. And then I meet with every young man that comes on campus to go through a presentation. And, you know, I mean, I'm John Doerr's position coach. I recruited a kicker last year. But the reality of it is I'm an area recruiter. I try to identify. I'll be involved, but we don't get Tariq Bracy without Todd Light and Mike Elko. We don't get Jack Lamb without Clark Lee. So it's the area recruiters are out there identifying. We get the coordinators involved. We get the position coaches involved, and it truly becomes a collective effort now in this day and age of college football.
You mentioned Bracy. His recruitment is interesting to me, not only because it seemed like he may have been under-recruited, but also he had a twin brother that at some point he thought about trying to play college football with. It seems like a unique situation. How did you handle that and go about making things clear that how you guys wanted to recruit him and what his options were? Okay, well, I can't speak directly to his brother because he is still considered a PSA. I give Tariq and his family an incredible amount of credit for the courage that he showed to, I got to be careful about how I handle this. There were options that existed where they were together. Tariq made a courageous decision to do what's best for him and his future. They have an incredibly tight relationship. It's an incredible family. Mom and dad are wonderful, hardworking people. And ultimately, I do believe that it will work out well for all of them. But it was a unique situation. It was a factor in the recruitment. Tariq is one of these guys. One of the reasons I love him, it's
it's interesting. Their greatest strengths can sometimes be their weaknesses too. Like getting Tariq on the phone was like an act of Congress, and my wife would grow incredibly frustrated with, me being downstairs on the phone at 1:30 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, because that was my best chance to get Tariq to pick up the phone. He was not a guy that was look at me in the recruiting process, look at me constantly on Twitter, seeking offers, going to every camp to try and get his stars up. He just, hey, I'm blessed to have this opportunity. His recruitment, frankly, probably would have been bigger had he sought that, but he was not an attention-seeking guy. So it made for a pretty unique deal. And honestly, when Tariq called to say I'm coming, I was a little caught off guard. I called back here and said, guys, I think we ought to be prepared for the fact that he might go somewhere else because of all the factors that were involved.
And what do you feel like, being your first cycle as recruiting coordinator here, what are you most proud of about how this class came together?
The fit. That was something that Mr. Swarbrick and Coach Kelly, the three of us talked about when I came back, when I was blessed to come back, was there are a lot of talented football players out there, but not all of them fit who we are. And we're not going to hide from what makes us different. We're not going to apologize for it. The things that make Notre Dame distinct, there are enough really good football players across the country that embrace what makes us different and what makes this place special. And I think we were able to kind of re-emphasize that. And I'm very, very proud of that. And I think we got a really good group of kids that were fun to recruit. And I hope that we will add to this group, because there's still some work to do.
You've worked for a few different head coaches. How would you compare Brian Kelly and how he attacks recruiting to some of the other guys you've worked for?
He's as active and competitive about it as anybody else that I've worked for. I think the great thing about Coach Kelly is that if the coordinators or a position coach has a strong conviction about a young man, Coach will hear him out and say, okay, if everybody's on board, then let's go. He is not a micromanager, but that's a good thing sometimes. And the coordinators know what they're looking for and know what they want, and we're able to build that way. I think the communication between both sides of the ball this year was really good too. It was not two separate islands working separate from themselves, and that's important when it comes to the scholarships too. I mean, we got to make sure that we're allocating the scholarships correctly on both sides of the ball, and there was great communication. And I think we got to get back to guys recruiting their areas. And I think, for example, Autry Denson does a great job. He has Florida. Autry comes back with defensive names in Florida. Hey, I was in the, it's easy. Anybody can pull up the top 300 in the country. We just log onto your phone. You can do that. But, I mean, it's the area recruiter that's going to find a Jameer. It's an area recruiter that's going to find a Tariq, a Paul Moala. I mean, the area recruiters are going to find those guys, and then as we pass them up the chain, we're going to find a couple of fits that way.
And then lastly for me, you are in charge of doing some recruiting out in California, like you mentioned. Mm-hmm. How important was it for you to be able to establish yourself with the presence to get commitments on the West Coast here in the cycle? Oh,
I'd never left the West Coast. I just changed golf shirts. I mean, it's relationships, and going into the high schools that we went into, Tariq Bracy at Milpitas, we had ties to that high school at Nevada. I mean, so it's relationships. It's built that way. So it's no different for Dell or Chip or Mike Elko, any of the new guys. Clark Lee. Clark Lee's in the Mid-Atlantic where he's from. Clark knows all those coaches, and when we pick those recruiting areas, that's part of the decision-making process, is where a guy's tied in and know people. Because often what you'll find is you will identify a player because you sat in a coach's office and said, all right, who's the best player you saw in your area this year? And they'll put you onto a guy that you didn't know about, and it's part of how it works. So, okay.
Coach, I kind of have a question about how you handled this new signing day, just from a big picture standpoint. When you guys first got together as a staff and you're kind of going over the calendar and everything, did you kind of view this signing day like you did the February one, where like, hey, we're looking to get things done, and then you kind of reset the board, or is it sort of part of a longer process?
No, I think we looked at this date as the date, and that we knew full well that there were going to be young men that we're recruiting that had made it very clear from the beginning, I'm going to February. But I think one of the things that you have to do, which Coach Kelly was great, you can't be waiting on 5 of those guys at one position, because what if you go 0 for 5? And you know, it used to be, all right, here's our A list, here's our B list. Well, a lot of people's B lists have signed letters today. That B list shrunk a lot. So you've got to be very careful about how many people are you willing to wait out at a given position, because if you don't strike gold, you could end up with a hole in a recruiting class because you held off guys that were signing. So there's had to be some strategic planning in terms of that. In terms of how many guys actually sign in the Power 5 and how many hold out, I don't think anybody knew. I think, you know, one of the things that we did was ask the basketball coaches, how does it go for you guys? I remember having this conversation with Pat Fitzgerald at a committee meeting at the AFCA. How are you approaching this? And he said, one of the things we've done is talk to a bunch of basketball coaches to see how it goes out. And really the information we got back was ultimately the early signing date becomes the signing date. And there are going to be some outliers out there for specific reasons. The elite of the elite that can tell everybody, that are good enough to say, hey, I'm going to decide in February, and if you have a scholarship for me, great. And obviously that group is very small. There are going to be guys out there that have academic question marks that people are not going to want to sign until transcripts come in or grades come in. That doesn't affect us, because we don't swim in that pool, which is fine. That's part of who we are. And then, you know, there are guys that just circumstances have made it. I mean, California just finished their state championship games. How many official visits could those kids make if they were on a championship run? So there are just some circumstances that guys were like, listen, I'm just not ready yet. So it's all kind of new for us, and we are trying to do the best we can and make really good, educated decisions. And you know, a year from now, we're going to take a step back and see if we need to retool our thinking a little bit.
Obviously, for fans, for people that are subscribers to our sites, it's always fun to kind of talk about where a class is ranked and how many 4 stars and 5 stars you got. But sometimes that can maybe mislead how good the class is, because maybe you load up on one side of the ball or one position. When you look at this class as far as meeting your needs, the balance, offense, defense, upfront skill, and all that, how do you feel your staff and you guys kind of put together this class from a balance standpoint?
Yeah, if I could just back up for 1 second. It's amazing. Everybody talks about how great the classes are, right? And they put stars on them. Talk to me in 10 years. That's when you'll know how good a class was, because there's always a 5-star somewhere in America that's going to be the next great player that never gets on the field and ends up transferring 3 times. And then there's somebody that you've never heard of. Baker Mayfield won the Heisman. He was a walk-on. Who ranked Baker Mayfield 4 or 5 years ago as this dude is a surefire? So that's, you got to be, we know that as coaches. Now I understand the fan base and the websites, and it's spring training, right? Everybody's going to win the World Series because, you know, hope springs eternal. In terms of meeting our needs, we felt confident that the places we needed to create competition quickly, we were able to identify guys that we think can do that. But nobody really knows. I mean, my dad told me once that, you know, he's in the Hall of Fame, and he looked back at all his drafts and he said, I hit about 650. And he's in the Hall of Fame for doing it. So if you bat 500-600 in a recruiting class and look up and say, we had 2- and 3-year starters and impactful players and good kids and good students, then you're doing a heck of a job. It's just, obviously we feel good because they're ours, they're in our family. We don't feel like we made any mistakes, but ultimately time will tell.
I guess my question was not about that you feel you made mistakes with the players that you landed, but more so, do you feel like you've been able to kind of hit all your targets? I mean, when you start putting together a class, say we need a quarterback, we need to hit corners. Do you feel like you hit those targets?
I think we have addressed the vast majority of them. I think in the places that Coach talked about, willingness to keep adding, or obviously if we're willing to add at spots, it's because we feel like, you know, we can further address those needs. So.
You had, I think, by my count, I could be off here, but I believe you had 8 players in this class, 8 of the 20 that played for a state championship, and that doesn't include Houston Griffith, who obviously is not able to play for a state championship, but played on an undefeated team. Is that sort of just a byproduct of the players you recruit, or do you guys kind of actively recruit players that come from sort of that winning background?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think, you know, when you can look at a guy and say he's a winner, that matters. I think when guys come out of winning programs and winning cultures, I think that matters. I loved Coach's statement about Phil playing basketball. I keep, you know, we have multi-sport athletes in this class, and we just competitors, right? I mean, we want guys that, you know, one of the great things about Phil is not only does he want the ball in his hand at the end of the football game, he wants to shoot the 3 at the end of the basketball game. You know, Tariq Bracey's an outfielder and steals bases. You know, the more they compete, the better. But yes, recruiting players out of established winning programs, and you know what the culture is, that is another piece of information that works in their favor.
Similar to what you talked about with 2 sport players, I was looking at your defensive back class, and by my count, I think 4 of the 5 played both ways this year. And then Houston obviously had an offensive background before at IMG. Again, is that sort of just okay, those are guys that we like that happen to play both, or do you guys kind of look for those guys that are just, you know, maybe football players? You know, obviously Tariq is a good DB, but I mean, he made his living this year rushing for over 2,000 yards on offense.
but when you have a coordinator like Mike Elko and you have Todd Light, that we can look at offensive film and say, we see the athletic traits that lead us to believe this guy can play corner at a very high level. The more they're out there, the more opportunity there is for us to evaluate, and that is never a bad thing. And frankly, there's a toughness there. When a guy plays 100 plays a game, you can appreciate that. I mean, when a coach says, hey, this guy never comes off the field, that's pretty meaningful. That holds weight for us.
Hey, Brian, you mentioned that there's still some work to do. You're at 20 now. Just, is there an ideal number or an estimate where you want to get to for?
No, I think it's fluid. I mean, we're not, you know, Coach Kelly talked about the 85 scholarship limit, and I know that's something that, you know, our fan base follows, but that's always fluid. You know, there's personnel decisions being made by young men on our team. There's always grades. You just look at the culture of college athletics in general right now. People are transferring at a much higher rate than they did, say, 10 years ago. So I think what we've been able to do with the help of Dave Poloquin is look back at like the last 6, 7, 8 years and say, all right, on average, how much turnover was there for whatever reason? And let's go under the assumption that there's going to be a little bit of turnover again this year. And sometimes you don't know who they are. Guys just come in and surprise you. And my experience as a head coach taught me that was there's one time a year there's going to be a guy that walks in and says, I'm just not happy, and it's going to absolutely floor you. But that's the nature of the world that we live in today. Guys want immediate success and happiness, and you know, somebody's going to decide that this is not for me. So we've tried to take that into account, but we are acutely aware of the 85, and we are and we're factoring those things in. A number, we're sitting here at 20 today. I know we have the ability to go past 25 because our great compliance office has told us we can count a couple back. We're not going to take guys just to take guys, but they got to address needs. But we could go to 24, 25. We may go to 21, 22. We'll kind of see how it plays out here through the course of the rest of the recruiting period. So.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.